present. People talk about trusting in life. They say, how can I learn to trust in life? You can't learn to trust. And that's the greatest thing you have. If you have no trust in life, then you're a little fearful entity rushing around, running around continuously in fear. You have no trust. How can I learn to trust? What is trust? Trust is simply this: no fear. It's no more than the absence of fear. Trust is your natural state. Fear obscures your natural state. When fear is gone, trust is there. It was always there. Trust is, I trust in life. Where is life? Here, now. And then you notice that the enormous gap between what the mind imagines life to be, which is fearful, and the reality of what is. Reality, compared to what the mind creates as my mind-made reality, reality is very benevolent. The mind reality is very harsh, what the mind creates as its reality. So when you look at people's lives, the suffering is derived from thought, believing in all the thoughts that the mind throws up about situations, my life, and so on. Without that, there would only ever be the benevolence of life at this moment. When you trust in this moment, which is trusting in life, life looks after you. It's like learning that you don't need to struggle to keep above water. When you learn to swim, at first you panic. You think you have to move as fast as you can to keep above water. And many people live their whole life like that, trying to keep their head above water. They never learn. All you have to just breathe, and the water actually carries you. You hardly need to move at all. You just go. And this is what Jesus means when he pointed to the flowers and said they are not anxious about tomorrow, they are not struggling, they are not making effort, and yet life, when he said Father, it means the one life, the one consciousness. The life looks after them. If they can live like that, surely you can live in the same way, where you feel you are not struggling to survive or to make a living, but realize and are open to being lived by life, to be an expression of the one life, not a little entity trying to make it. And so life lives through you. How else could it be? And then, without the separation between me and life, fear comes to an end. When that separation comes to an end between me and life. I am life. There isn't me and life. So work with the fear that's still there. Always bring acceptance to it. Don't make it into a problem. Don't try to figure out how to get rid of it. Be present with it. It's just like as if a dark cloud came into the room, or a thunder cloud, or whatever, and you just watch it. And then it wants to move into your mind. You watch it, no? Keep it where it is. It's here. And then it tries again. And the mind says, I don't understand this. Why am I so fearful? Never mind, just watch it.
Hello, thank you very much for your very enlightened teaching, but I have a question that awoke me at 3 a.m. this morning, and I'm hoping you might answer it so I'm not woken up again. It was triggered off by comments you made on presence. You mentioned about presence being connected with the feeling of our aliveness, and then you talked about feeling as you walk across the grass, perhaps out in nature. And I wondered whether you think it has anything to do with a sense called the kinesthetic sense, which apparently means motion, feeling, the feeling of motion, and how deeply presence is connected with the kinesthetic sense. And you also mentioned listening to silence, and I wondered, apparently there's a vestibular sense or proprioceptive sense in between the ears that senses movement against the eardrum, and I was wondering whether you think that the kinesthetic sense, the proprioceptive sense, is deeply rooted in our ability to sense our own presence, to tune into presence.
Thank you. And then what happened that night at 3 o'clock? Did you leave that thought and re-entered presence?
I re-entered presence, and then I felt that what I was feeling my own presence, but I then felt that what I was feeling was movement, and then my mind took over and said, well, presence is feeling motion. Okay. And then my presence was disturbed by the thought that it's feeling motion.
This is a good example. Before I look at the details of the question, I don't know if I can give an answer, but we'll see. The mind tries to understand what presence is, because that's what the mind does. The mind tries to figure things out, to work it out, to get a hold of it, to grasp it somehow, so that I can understand what presence really is. And unfortunately, it can't ever. It can only understand perhaps certain things about it. When the mind talks about presence through thought, you can talk about it. The most the mind can do is point to it by saying this or that sends you in the right direction. But it cannot understand what presence is, because presence is the essence, for example, of Zen Buddhism. And this is why people study Zen for 20 or 30 years and still don't know what it is. This is why an otherwise extremely interesting writer, philosopher, Arthur Koestler, traveled, I believe in the 50s, to Japan to write a book about Zen Buddhism. He had a highly developed mind, so he interviewed the Zen monks and spent several months there. And finally he wrote a book which was not his best, probably his worst. Some of his books are very good, but very intellectual, but penetrating analysis of certain things. But he could never understand Zen at all, because he tried to understand it through the mind. And he finally came to the conclusion that it was absolute nonsense, with which the Zen monks were only too ready to agree. So that, yes, you're right, it's absolute nonsense. And a great hindrance in the arising of presence is a developed mind like yours trying to figure out what it is and not being able to step beyond the stream of thinking into presence. Because presence is the cessation of thought without loss of consciousness. Now you have a definition. The cessation of thought without loss of consciousness. Wow. Where do you go from there? More thought? So that takes you to the edge. And whatever you say beyond that, it can only be more thought, but not the cessation of thought, not presence. The alertness that is there when thought subsides. Whatever else can be said about it is peripheral. About, not it. You can talk about it. So you can talk about, yes, you could write a PhD, but it would never touch presence, but it could be very interesting. It could be about presence. Would it take anybody into presence? I don't know. Maybe there would be one page. You say, this page, on page 300 of my PhD is the edge. Read up to there and then throw it away. So you could ask, what is the relationship between presence and the senses? What is the relationship between presence and perception? Between presence and the feeling of kinesthetic, whatever you call it. One could say presence can flow into anything. Presence can flow into the auditory sense. So let's see what that is like on a practical level. You're listening. You're listening so intensely that no thought arises, because any thought would diminish your ability to listen. You're listening. Let's use a parable that I believe Jesus used. Somebody is going to arrive. You don't know when he's going to come. The master is going to come home. The servant is waiting. He has to be alert so that he can hear the master when he comes. He may be very quiet. So he remains awake, listening. Already, presence is there. Then a noise arises. A slight noise. The door opens. Space and an object in space. The object here is an auditory object. It could be a visual object. It could be an inner object, like a thought. But what we call listening really wasn't really listening, because when you were listening, for a long time there was no noise to listen to. It's like being in a completely dark room and trying to see, not trying to, but intensely looking, but there's nothing to see. Or looking at the sky that's totally blue, the vast expanse of sky, and it has no object in it. Perhaps the sun is just behind you on the horizon, but the entire sky is so clear and you're looking up into the sky and there's nothing there to see for you. So there's no object that arises in the field of consciousness. Or you're listening and there's no noise, no auditory object arises in the space. The space that is presence, the vast space that is presence, the vast stillness that is presence. Or it could be that you are listening, a sound arises and subsides. So anything that arises in presence is an object in consciousness, whereas presence is consciousness itself. Doesn't matter what feeling or whatever it is, bodily feeling, whatever arises. You have two dimensions object consciousness, which is a normal state for most humans, which means they only know themselves through objects that arise in their consciousness. Every thought, every emotion, every sense perception, every experience is a form, an object in the field of consciousness. Now it happens to some human beings who suddenly realize another dimension in themselves. And when it happens accidentally, it's usually because an object in their life that they had strongly identified with dies, dissolves. We call it disaster or death, the great loss. The big enterprise that I built up collapses. The wife dies, the child dies, the house crumbles, everything collapses under me. The object that I had identified with dissolves, and that leaves a hole in my life, a big gaping hole. Now some people cannot fill up that hole quickly enough. It's too active again. The enterprise collapses. Okay, I'm going to build up a new one. Another 20 years. Or you allow that to be because you say, okay, it drives you into surrender. The fabric of your existence has a hole in it, an empty space. And often it happens to people through a great loss or death in their lives. Suddenly, an inner shift happens. And there's suddenly enormous peace, serenity, aliveness. And they don't know what happened to them. It's because the space, what we could call space consciousness, which has no form, which is consciousness itself, came through that hole of death and destruction. Death and destruction, which look dreadful from the point of view of the human mind, the ego, are also ultimately benevolent, because through death and destruction, a hole appears in your existence, which consisted of objects, my life. This is my life. And suddenly my life goes to pieces. There may be some of you who experience that. Suddenly things all collapsed around you. And so through that there's an opening. And through that comes what Buddhists call the deathless, which is the realization of the formless dimension of life, which is consciousness itself, the space that you are, the consciousness that you are. So to some it comes through disaster and death, and to others it comes through realization, through the help of a spiritual teaching, and to many it comes a combination of great loss in your own life plus a spiritual teaching, and the two come together. And this is why many of you are here. There are quite a few, I'm certain of that, who would not be here if they had not experienced this or that disaster in their lives. And for many people that creates the first opening. So we have the dimensions of consciousness, object consciousness, thoughts, one thing after another, experiences, things that are all important. Every object is so important. And then, what is it that makes that whole thing possible? Space, the underlying, formless, pure consciousness that you are. Stillness, presence. It becomes presence when you know it, when it recognizes itself. But you can't, not through thought, what I've just said only points. What I've just said isn't presence, although the presence underlies it.
Can you explain to us, are there any differences between male and female spirituality? Ways of accessing the now that are easier for men and which are easier for females?
Thank you. No, I'm stuck in a male body for a while. But I already, from what I have observed, and what I also mentioned briefly in the Power of Now, one difference is that, first of all, it's both men and women have very active minds. Both men and women have pain bodies. Generally speaking, the major obstacle, and it's not ultimately an obstacle, because once you work with an obstacle, it becomes a help. The major obstacle, let's use that word for a moment, for men is the mind, identification with head, mental. The major obstacle for women, and again there are many exceptions, is the pain body. They are related. It's not to say that in some cases it's reversed. Also, it happens. So, to be identified excessively with thought, women have that too, but men have it even more. An active pain body, men have that too very much, and women even more. Women have also the collective female pain body, because for thousands of years women have been put in a position of almost slavery. Not before then, but the shift from a female-oriented society to male-oriented society happened several thousand years ago. Very earlier societies, most god figures were female. And then the shift happened because humans moved more and more into thinking. And then the shift happened, the representation of the divine then began to assume a male form. And they needed to exclude the female. So a female was then subjected to considerable suffering as simply because they were women. They could be sold and bought and used and didn't own property. And if most of these spiritual teachers that we know from the past, not anymore now, there are many female teachers and more are coming, but most of them that we know from the past seem to be male. Probably not because the realization came only to men, it's because society wouldn't even recognize the female as a teacher, most likely. And perhaps she was only known to very few people, any female who realized the truth. And there's maybe some exceptions to that also. At first, Christianity tried to exclude the female altogether. So instead of having, as a kind of representation, the father, the mother, and the son, they had the Father, the Holy Spirit, and the Son. And the Holy Spirit is probably male too. And it's only later that through popular demand, the female goddess figure of Mary became in some parts of the church very important, and so the female was brought back that way, although originally Mary was not important at all. Those head-dominated people, they were all men who tried to figure out what we need to believe in. They wanted to exclude the female, but there was an enormous need in humans for the female, so it came back. So in some places, the Virgin Mary is more important than Jesus. People are much more interested in Mary than in Jesus. It's a representation of the feeling. Now, when presence expresses itself, first there is the formless emanation of presence. That is no difference whether that is a male or a female body there. That comes through stillness. The formless emanation of presence, whether there's a woman or a man here, in the stillness, the two merge into one. Stillness is the oneness. But as soon as presence flows into words, which is how a spiritual teaching happens, out of the field of presence come words, and the words carry the energy of presence still. That's why they are not just information. The words that come are charged with presence, so to speak, and that's hard to figure out through the mind, but that's how it works. And there already they flow into the form of the words. Presence flows into the form, and that form will vary then whether a man is teaching or a woman is teaching. There may be a difference. Now, many humans who are rooted in presence, you can hardly say whether they are male or female. Of course, biologically they remain either male or female, but their energy field is quite balanced in many. So the pure femaleness, the pure maleness often disappears, and there's a balance between male and female in many spiritual teachers. And in some, when they get older, you can't even say, is that a man or a woman? Can't tell anymore. The main thing is to see a woman needs to be very conscious of the pain body, because there's the accumulation of female pain.